She was the background noise in a city that never listened. He was the man who had everything, except the memory of who gave it to him. When a ghost from his past reappeared with tired hands and a story of her own, the carefully constructed walls of his world were about to be shattered by the one thing he never saw coming, a debt of kindness. He only stepped into the roadside diner for the coffee, a quick, bitter jolt to cut through the monotony of a cross-state drive. The air, thick with the smell of stale grease and burnt sugar, clung to the lapels of his $1,000 suit. And then he saw her. Behind the counter, wiping away a sticky ring of syrup with a slow, practiced motion, was Sarah Jenkins. The name hit him like a physical blow, a forgotten echo from a life he had meticulously paved over with success and applause. It was the same face, though etched with a weariness that 20 years of hard living had carved into her skin. Her hands, the hands that had once secretly slipped him $20 for textbooks and paid his exam fee so he wouldn't be expelled, were now chapped and red. He was James Carter, founder of a tech empire, a man whose name opened doors. She was a waitress in a cheap cafe, a ghost in a worn-out apron. The contrast was a gut punch more potent than any boardroom negotiation. She had given him a future, and he had forgotten her name. The conversation, when it finally came, was a clumsy, hesitant thing. He ordered his coffee, and her eyes, clouded with the fatigue of a double shift, held only a flicker of recognition. "James? James Carter?" she asked, her voice raspy. He nodded, the sound of his own name feeling foreign and undeserved. A chasm of unspoken history opened between them in the sticky silence of the diner. He looked at her, then at the gleaming hood of his German sedan visible through the grimy window, and understood with sickening clarity. Without her, none of it would exist. Her small act of defiance against a system designed to keep boys like him down was the single stone that had started the avalanche of his success. As she spoke, her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from exhaustion. She told him about the night shifts, about her teenage son, Michael, a bright kid with a fierce hunger to learn, a hunger she couldn't afford to feed. The world tilted on its axis for the first time that day when a portly man in his 50s swaggered in from the back office, his face a mask of sour authority. James knew him instantly. Mr. Henderson, the old high school gym coach who preached that poor boys don't get to win and had tried to shake him down for a fee to join the team. Now he was the owner of this place, and he directed his venom at Sarah. "Jenkins, that table's been waiting for 5 minutes. You think they're here to admire the decor?" he sneered, his voice loud enough for the handful of patrons to hear. He belittled her, threatened her job over a misplaced salt shaker, his words dripping with the same casual cruelty James remembered from 2 decades ago. The humiliation was a public spectacle, and James felt a hot, familiar rage coil in his stomach. The second blow came when Michael, Sarah's son, walked in, a stack of mail in his hands for his mom. He was a good kid, polite and a little shy, but his eyes held a spark of intelligence that was impossible to miss. He handed Sarah a thick manila envelope, something he'd found while cleaning out his grandmother's attic. Inside, among yellowed photographs, was a bundle of old legal documents, a deed, foreclosure notices, and a letter detailing how a larger, more aggressive company had systematically squeezed her family's small hardware business out of town, bankrupting them. The name of the company's owner was printed in stark, unforgiving letters: William Carter, James's father. He stood frozen, caught between the guilt of a past he never knew and the horror of a present he was only just beginning to understand. The debt was older, deeper, and far more painful than he could have ever imagined. The finale was not a quiet transaction, but a revolution. The next day, James returned. He didn't come alone. He brought his lawyer. In front of the morning regulars and a stunned staff, he stood up for Sarah as Henderson began his daily tirade. He didn't just defend her, he dismantled the man's petty kingdom. He bought the diner, cash, right then and there. He fired Henderson on the spot, his voice calm but unyielding, the public humiliation a mirror image of what Sarah had endured. But that wasn't the real payment. He turned to Sarah and Michael and announced the formation of a new college fund, its first recipient being her son, an endowment large enough to cover any university he chose. Because a debt that began with a quiet act of kindness in a dusty school hallway, he explained to the silent room, could never be left unpaid. The story was no longer about money or success. It was about how a single, forgotten act of goodness could return with the force of a tidal wave, washing away years of injustice and forcing the truth into the light. For Sarah, the world was a constant, low hum of indifference. The clatter of cheap ceramic plates, the hiss of the coffee machine, the drone of the ancient air conditioner that smelled of damp metal and decay. She moved through the diner like a phantom, her presence acknowledged only when a cup was empty or a bill was due. The customers' gazes slid right through her, their minds on highways, deadlines, and lovers. She was the human equivalent of beige wallpaper. Sometimes the invisibility was a shield. Other times it was a slow-acting poison. A quiet snicker when she misheard an order, her accent a little too rural for their city tastes. A dismissive wave of a hand. The condescendingly slow way a businessman would explain his order, as if she were a child. "Just a black coffee, sweetie. Got it?" Each small slight was a grain of sand, and after 20 years, she felt like she was carrying a desert on her shoulders. Inside, a tired, quiet fire burned, a heat that had long ago stopped hoping for fuel. The spark that would ignite it all came on a Tuesday. The diner was unusually busy, a bus tour having descended like a flock of hungry locusts. The air was thick with the smells of frying bacon and impatience. Sarah was moving at a frantic pace, her worn sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. A man at a corner booth, dressed in a crisp shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent, called her over with a snap of his fingers. "Hey, you, waitress," he said, his voice laced with an easy, inherited arrogance. "This steak is well done. I asked for medium rare. Can you people not even get that right?" His friends at the table chuckled. One of them pulled out his phone, a smirk on his face, and started recording. "Maybe you should stick to pouring coffee," the man continued, pushing the plate away. "Leave the complex tasks to someone with a bit more upstairs." The insult, so naked and public, hung in the air. The laughter from his table was a splash of gasoline. Around them, other customers either stared with pity or quickly looked away, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. Sarah felt her face flush, a hot, prickling shame. She lowered her eyes, murmured an apology, and took the plate, her hands trembling. The weight of the desert on her back suddenly felt unbearable. But deep within the smoldering embers of her exhaustion, a tiny, defiant flame flickered to life. James Carter watched the scene unfold from his seat at the counter, the bitter coffee forgotten in his hand. He saw the man's sneer, the glint of the phone's camera, the way Sarah seemed to shrink into herself. He recognized the man, a junior executive from a rival firm, known for his abrasive style. But what he saw in Sarah was something else entirely. Just as the chaos from the bus tour reached its peak, the kitchen door flew open. The cook, a young man overwhelmed and sweating, yelled that the main produce delivery was an hour late and they were out of potatoes for home fries. Panic rippled through the staff. Henderson, the owner, began to shout. The whole operation was grinding to a halt. And then, in the eye of the storm, Sarah acted. She grabbed a guest check pad and a pen. In the space of 30 seconds, her pen flew across the paper, creating a diagram of logic and efficiency. Shift all breakfast sandwich orders to toast instead of buns. We have bread. Reroute Table 5's order to the grill. It'll free up the fryer. Leo, start prepping the emergency frozen hash browns, but only for the next 3 tables, she commanded, her voice low but clear, cutting through the panic. She then picked up the phone, dialed the supplier, and in a calm, firm tone, negotiated a partial, immediate delivery of the most critical items from a sister warehouse across town, securing a discount for the trouble. The space around her seemed to warp. The snickering executive stared, his mouth slightly agape. The chaos subsided, replaced by a hum of focused activity. James's heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking at a 4-star general of logistics, a master of crisis management. He was looking at a genius. After the rush subsided and the arrogant executive had left, James walked over to her table. The air was still hazy with cooking fumes, but the tension had broken. "That was incredible," he said, his voice filled with a genuine awe that made her look up, startled. He gestured vaguely toward the now orderly kitchen. "How did you do that?" Sarah shrugged, wiping down the table with a damp cloth. The gesture was automatic, ingrained. "You do what you have to," she said quietly. When you're juggling 3 bills on one paycheck and your son's science fair project needs a circuit board by tomorrow, you learn how to make things work. She spoke without a hint of self-pity, stating it as a simple fact of her existence. He pressed gently, asking about her life, about Michael. Her stories were a tapestry of quiet sacrifices and relentless problem-solving, of fixing a broken washing machine with a YouTube tutorial, of creating a color-coded schedule to manage her 3 part-time jobs, of learning just enough code to help her son with his programming homework. Then she looked him straight in the eye, the fatigue momentarily replaced by that flicker of fire. "I learned," she said, her voice barely a whisper but heavy with resolve, "so that no one could ever tell my son that he wasn't enough to make it." The words landed on James like stones. His initial shock and guilt morphed into a profound, humbling respect. He was on his way to a make-or-break presentation for a new logistics platform his company was launching. As he was about to leave the diner, his phone buzzed violently. It was his COO. A critical data server in their Phoenix hub had gone down, jeopardizing the entire live demonstration. The backup was failing. It was a catastrophe. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. On a wild, inexplicable impulse, he turned back to Sarah. He pulled out his tablet, the screen a terrifying cascade of red error messages. "I know this is crazy," he said, his voice tight with stress. "But look at this. Our whole system is routed through Phoenix. We're dead in the water." He expected her to look confused, to wave him away. Instead, she leaned in, her brow furrowed in concentration. The smell of bleach from her cleaning cloth was sharp in the air. She scanned the complex flowchart, her finger tracing a line of code. "You have a redundant server in Dallas, right?" she asked. He nodded. "But the switchover protocol is failing." She pointed to a small, overlooked data packet transfer node. "It's not the protocol. It's a bottleneck here. The system is trying to move too much non-essential data. If you manually purge the cache logs from this node, it should free up enough bandwidth for the primary functions to migrate." It was simple, obvious in retrospect, and utterly brilliant. No one on his team of highly paid engineers had seen it. He relayed the instructions to his COO. A minute later, the phone buzzed again. The system was back online. The presentation was saved. He stared at Sarah, who was now calmly refilling a sugar dispenser, as if she hadn't just saved a multi-million-dollar project. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he couldn't just walk out of her life again. The next morning, he made her an offer that hung in the air between them, as surreal as a dream. He didn't offer her a reward. He offered her a job, senior operations analyst, a corner office, a salary that made her eyes water. Her first reaction was fear, a visceral, gut-wrenching terror. "James, I can't," she stammered, twisting the corner of her apron. "I have a high school diploma. I serve coffee. These people, they'll eat me alive." The ghost of the sneering man with the cell phone camera haunted her words. She was terrified of the inevitable humiliation, of being exposed as an imposter. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, for the last 20 years, you've been running a complex, under-resourced, high-stress organization of one. You've managed logistics, finance, and human resources with zero budget and impossible deadlines. Your results speak for themselves. I don't care about your resume. I care about your talent." His conviction was a steadying hand. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time in years, it was joined by a fragile, fluttering thing. Hope. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of new beginnings and terrifying uncertainty, and said yes. Her first day at Carter Technologies was like stepping onto another planet. The building was a monument of glass and steel, the air chilled to a precise temperature and smelling faintly of ozone and expensive perfume. The silence of the open-plan office was a stark contrast to the diner's constant clatter. It was a silence that felt heavy with judgment. Whispers trailed in her wake like static electricity. "That's her. The waitress. It's some kind of PR stunt, a feel-good story for the annual report." A sleek young manager with a practiced smile called it a bold diversity initiative to her face, the compliment a thinly veiled insult. She found a crisp, formal invitation to a critical project kickoff meeting tucked under another analyst's keyboard, her own copy conveniently missing. The passive aggression was a language she didn't speak, but she understood its meaning perfectly. She felt the old invisibility creeping back, this time colder and more cutting. She sat at her gleaming, empty desk, the knot of fear in her stomach tightening into a cold, hard stone. They gave her the North Star project. It was a well-known disaster, a logistical software integration that was months behind schedule and bleeding money. It was a poisoned chalice, a task designed for her to fail. The team assigned to her was a collection of resentful veterans and ambitious young analysts who treated her with a polite, icy disdain. They called her ma'am, a sign of respect that felt more like a barrier. She didn't argue or try to assert an authority she didn't feel. She simply opened the files and began to work. She spent the first week doing nothing but reading, reports, emails, code annotations, budget overruns. She listened during meetings, saying little, her pen scratching quietly in a spiral notebook. She wasn't just looking at the data, she was seeing the story behind it, the human errors, the communication breakdowns, the flawed assumptions. She started asking quiet questions, not in the big meetings, but one-on-one at people's desks. She wasn't a boss, she was a detective. Slowly, methodically, she untangled the mess. She created a new workflow, not on a fancy software suite, but on a massive whiteboard using colored markers. It was simple, visual, and it worked. The project, which had been careening toward a cliff, slowly began to turn around. The deadline was 2 weeks away, a ticking clock that fueled her every move. The first sign of a thaw came when the lead programmer, a notorious cynic, stopped by her desk. "That routing algorithm you sketched out," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It's not stupid." From him, it was the highest praise. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. Sarah's office, the one everyone had expected to remain empty, became the quiet center of the department. It started with the junior analysts, who came to her with questions they were too intimidated to ask their official managers. Then the veterans started stopping by, ostensibly to grab a coffee, but really to run a complex problem by her. She didn't give orders. She listened. She asked the right questions. She had a unique ability to see the person behind the job title, to understand their fears and their strengths. Where there had once been whispers about her place, there were now discussions about her methods. Her whiteboard diagrams were photographed and shared. Her simple, direct way of explaining complex problems became the new standard. She never raised her voice, never played political games. Her authority wasn't granted by a title. It was earned through competence and compassion. She was still Sarah, but now, when she walked through the office, the gazes that followed her were not filled with pity or scorn, but with a grudging, growing respect. James watched her transformation with a sense of vindication that was deeply personal. He saw the change, not just in her, but in the people around her. Her success wasn't just a personal victory, it was a proof of concept. It was evidence that talent was everywhere, often hidden in plain sight, buried under layers of prejudice and circumstance. Inspired, he announced a new company-wide program, personally funded and championed by him, the Keystone Initiative. It was designed to actively recruit and train individuals with unconventional backgrounds, mechanics with a knack for systems, stay-at-home parents with master-level organizational skills, short-order cooks who could manage chaos. It was a formal declaration of war on credentialism and bias, and he asked Sarah to be its public face, to lead the first series of workshops. She was terrified, but she knew she couldn't refuse. This was bigger than her. It was for all the others still standing in the shadows. The launch event was held in the company's largest auditorium. The room was packed with employees, industry press, and local dignitaries. The stage lights were hot and blinding. When James called her to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She gripped the sides of the lectern, her knuckles white. She didn't use the prepared speech. She just spoke. She told them about the diner, about the condescending remarks, about the feeling of being utterly invisible. For years, I was told, in 1,000 different ways, that I was just background noise, she said, her voice shaking but clear. And when people laugh at you or dismiss you or look right through you, you start to believe it. You start to shrink. But here's the thing I learned. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. When they were laughing, I was learning. When they were dismissing me, I was problem-solving. Today we are here to say that we will no longer mistake a quiet voice for a lack of talent. We are here to start listening. The silence that followed was profound. Then, a single person in the back began to clap. The sound was joined by another. and another, until the entire auditorium erupted in a wave of thunderous applause. People were getting to their feet. In that moment, she wasn't a project or a curiosity. She was a leader. As the applause washed over her, she saw Michael making his way through the crowd, his face beaming with pride. He was holding the old manila envelope from his grandmother's attic. He reached the stage and handed it to James, who had come to stand beside her. "I thought you should see this," Michael said. James opened the clasp and slid out the contents. The documents were brittle with age. As he read, the color drained from his face. It was all there: the predatory loans, the leveraged buyout, the systematic destruction of Jenkins Hardware, a thriving local business. And at the bottom of every page, the signature of the man who had orchestrated it all, his father, William Carter. The applause in the room faded to a dull roar in his ears. The triumph of the moment turned to ash in his mouth. He had spent months trying to repay a $20 debt to Sarah, only to discover his family owed her a lifetime. The next morning, James drove back to the diner. Sarah was with him. They found Henderson in his usual spot, berating a young busboy. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked up to the counter, his lawyer by his side, and informed Henderson that Carter Technologies had acquired the property and the business an hour ago. He was being terminated, effective immediately. Henderson sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red, but the finality in James's voice was absolute. In front of the entire staff, James turned to the head cook, a woman who had worked there for 30 years, and offered her the manager position with a raise and full benefits. Then he faced Sarah, the weight of his father's sins heavy on his shoulders. "This doesn't fix it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but it's a start." He announced the creation of the Jenkins Family Foundation, its first act to provide a full 4-year scholarship for Michael to any university of his choosing. It wasn't charity, it was restitution. A month later, the diner reopened. A new sign hung above the door: Sarah's Place. It was clean, bright, and bustling, but the most significant change was on the wall behind the counter. Encased in a simple, elegant shadow box was Sarah's old, stained waitress apron and her worn plastic name tag. Beneath it, a small brass plaque was engraved with a single sentence: "Talent has no uniform." It became a local landmark, a quiet symbol of the city's most talked-about story. People would come in for coffee and take a picture of the display, sharing it online with their own stories of being overlooked and underestimated. Late one evening, weeks after the reopening, Sarah stood in her new office on the 40th floor. The city spread out below her, a glittering carpet of light and possibility. The silence was no longer judgmental. It was peaceful. On her desk, next to a stack of project files, sat her old, cracked name badge from the diner. She picked it up, the plastic warm against her skin. She thought of the countless people like her, working in the quiet, unseen corners of the world, their brilliance hidden in plain sight. Looking at her reflection in the vast window, she saw not a waitress or an executive, but a woman who had finally been seen. She whispered to the city lights, a promise to herself and to all of them. "Your turn is coming. We'll see you soon." The warm, victorious glow from her desk lamp illuminated her face, a quiet beacon in the night. Talent doesn't care about your zip code, your job title, or the color of your skin. Remember this story the next time you're about to look past someone who seems invisible.